Well, good morning. Welcome to class. We have spent some time in the last couple of weeks looking at some of the major events in World War II. And last week, Pastor Pete took us through Operation Barbarossa, in also Pearl Harbor, the event that took place in Pearl Harbor. And today, we're going to jump back a little bit in time and spend some time looking at something that many of you probably don't know a lot about, and that is the war in the Pacific Theater prior to the U.S. getting involved in 1941. At the end of 1941, they declared war on Japan at the end, right after Pearl Harbor, the very next day. But there was a lot going on, in fact, for decades going on in the Pacific Theater or Southeast Asia at that time that probably don't know about, and hopefully we'll be able to shine a little light on what went on there and draw some conclusions at the end and look at a little bit of what it takes to get to where we got to in that part of the world as we look at what we're going to look at today. So we're going to jump in a little bit, but we're looking at Japan's destruction of Korea and China mainly today. We'll look at the rest of the Pacific Theater just in terms of what happened as we move forward. But we'll keep our focus in those two countries for the most part and what went on around it as well. But anyway, let's jump into this. Japan's destruction of Korea and China. On your outline, we have a very, very brief history of Japan and its religion. As you can imagine, when you're spanning a couple thousand years, I'm not going to get it all down on this piece of paper, but we'll try and get what's important for us here as we move forward. So if you jump onto your outline, you'll notice that habitation in Japan, it dates back to prehistory. We have some known information when writing and archaeology discovered things around the 1st century AD. We do know that Japan was a collection of kingdoms and tribes that over time came together and were ruled by an emperor. And that emperor line, they trace back back to 660 AD, quite frankly, or it's BC. But the rule of the emperor gave way to military shoguns, and those two coexisted side by side for a lot of years until 1868. The Tokugawa Shogunate was the last, which was characterized by a strict class system and a lot of isolationist policy. Christianity was outlawed. It was a potential threat. And the Japanese people actually were banned from travel. They couldn't go out. They didn't want to bring any Western ideas back in. You weren't allowed to build ocean vessels, so none of those, so that nobody could leave. It was just the stuff that could be off the coast. That's how serious they were about their isolationism. It was a time of great growth during the Tokugawa Shogunate. They doubled in population. Agricultural practices improved. Roads were built, and literacy went up. So all those things were going on. But meanwhile, you had a lot of the nations, including the U.S., trying to come in and trade with Japan. And however, the Dutch were the only ones that had any privilege. They had one island that they were allowed to move to or trade from. It's the only place they were allowed to land, and they could trade from there. But that was all that was allowed. So there's a older map of sort of feudal Japan, all the different tribes and kingdoms, all ruled by different shoguns, and you can kind of see how that works out on that island there. So there's Tokugawa. There's a Japanese art of the last shogun. Samurais were also part of the story in this time. They were very they lived by a code, and they were very touchy, I guess we would call it. Offenses are taken very seriously, and the slightest offense will set them off. It's an easy way it's a broad brush way to say that. A lot more going on there, but I can't take care of that. I can't get too far into that, I should say. There's a lot there. I said a very, very brief history, right? In an attempt to end Japan's isolationist practices, the U.S. sent Commodore Matthew Perry, there he is on there, and his fleet of American gunships to Japan. This was in 1853, and basically forced them into trade and allowing ships to provision on Japanese soil. This inevitably what led to increased European activity, as well as the Japanese being subjected to unequal treaties. We basically told them what they were going to do, and they didn't really have much choice because we had gunships and they didn't. So that rankles. But it includes, no tariffs. Basically, they forced They forced the Japanese to allow foreigners to live on their land, and basically no retribution. They weren't subject to Japan's laws. The shogunate didn't have any answer to the American power and any of the foreign powers of the military, and as a result, the people lost confidence in the shogunate. It crumbled, and they were eventually thrown down, and the emperor came back into power. Now, the emperor, I told you, they ran side by side with the shoguns. They were still there. There was still a ruling emperor family. They just didn't have a lot of power. The power resided in the shoguns until this time when it crumbled, and through uprisings, the emperor came back into power. So there's some artist renderings and a picture of Commodore Matthew Perry coming into Japan and his warships up there in the upper right, but you get just a little bit of a flavor of what his entry into Japan was like. And what else do I got there? The Emperor Meiji. That's the next one we're going to get to. So the emperor comes back in, and he is now in charge. This is the first one, Emperor Meiji. After the shogun. He's not the first emperor, but the one that came in and ruled from 1868 to 1912. I'm back on the outline here. It was under his reign that Westernization went into full gear. He was a big proponent. They were taking in a lot of literature, art, trade goods, all kinds of stuff, and they were sending things out as well. As happens, European and U.S. traders, they brought new ideas, new goods, new weapons, and the Japanese incorporated them into all aspects of their lives. And as they became more westernized, they also asserted native Japanese values. So you had preserving the Japanese culture, you had a very high level of national pride that was going on. So this is all happening in the late 1800s into the 1900s. This is going to go into like hyperdrive, but they were very protective of their culture, didn't want to see it, which was part of what the isolation is. So they wanted some of the goods. They wanted a lot of the power that they saw that was displayed in the warships that the U.S. and other foreign countries had, but they wanted to maintain their own Japanese lifestyle. The most important value emphasized was the emperor's divine authority. This was huge, and will become even a greater focus as we get closer to World War II. The Shinto faith teaches that the emperor was descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the Japanese people were designated as the rulers of not only Japan, but they also were supposed to be rulers of the whole created world. They were all, in a sense, descended from gods, even though the emperor was the direct descent. There was a thought process, a mindset of in the Japanese people of that they were privileged in that regard to not only rule over Japan but the rest of the world. And the Shinto state was a state religion, and it was controlled, and the military was controlled solely by the emperor. The military was not answerable to any kind of the government or any elected officials that was there. Solely answerable to the emperor. Taking a page out of Western playbook, the military became very opportunistic, leading to colonial expansion in an attempt to compete with the foreign powers that came in. I broad brushstroked a lot of that there, okay? There's a lot of nuances and detailing, but I'm just trying to give you a general feel for what is going on in the country and in the mindset. That is a painting of Amaterasu, and a little bit of Shinto. Shinto means way of the gods. So a couple of aspects and rights to that. A lot of focus on kami spirits. You pay respects to them, and those can be, mainly ancestors, relatives, things like that. Ritual purity is an aspect. You cleanse yourself from wrong deeds. Food and drink offerings are involved in that. There is an afterlife. It reads a lot like Hades in the Greek mythology. There are funerals. Cremation is big in those, and ashes are, some of the ashes, they're spread, but some of the ashes are reserved for the family, and they'll put them in their home shrines and things like that as part of the connection to that spirit, that kami. Amulets and talismans are used for wishes, to have something that they would desire to happen, and for protection. And then there are ritual dances, and that is for the gods to come down and commune with them, but also for blessings on the family. So just some ideas of Shinto, just to give you a flavor of that. My wife always jokes because I always say, give you a flavor. So now you're going to be thinking of that. So if somebody's going to keep a tally on my thing, but I just remember she always says I say that. So there you go. This is it's spelled I-S-E in English, Ise Temple. It's the main temple of Shinto worship. Beautiful. And then religion in Japan, just to give you an idea, 51% Shinto. Buddhism is another one. I didn't mention that, but Buddhism is big in Japan as well. A lot of it is syncretistic. They've meshed them all together, so to speak, in that. And then you can see Christianity, non-religion, and other. There you go. That's what's going on in Japan. This graph's a little more recent in terms of their religion, but gives you an idea of that. All right, Japan and Korea. So Japan began asserting its influence over isolationist Korea. A lot of the countries in Southeast Asia had an isolationist policy. Korea was no different in this. And this started happening in the mid-1800s. A lot more background to that, but bear with me. Again, broad brushstroking. This happened with a change in Korean rule, and the country was ready to open up to foreign trade, and Japan was seeking to be preeminent in that relationship. It did just what the foreigners did to them, and that is forced unequal treaties on Korea, which eventually led to Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910 as a result of the First Sino-Japanese War. So, quick background on Korea. So they suffered from being basically in the middle of China and Japan in a tug-of-war. China had a lot of influence over them, and probably Korea enjoyed much more freedom in terms of being able to be its own country way more freedom under China and than it did in Japan. The Joseon Dynasty, they were the last dynasty. They ruled from 1392 to 1897. So you see that's a 600-year dynasty that ruled there. Sweeping reforms late in the 1800s, but they still remained strict isolationists. However, social unrest led to the end of the dynasty and the start of the Korean, and I mean short-lived Korean Empire. It was only a matter of like 10 or 15 years. But they were, at that time, they were opening up to foreign trade. In the war, the first Sino-Japanese War, Japan and China are fighting, and Japan, won that war, and so they were able to take over and be the influence of Korea at that particular time. And there's some Japanese soldiers in Korea there. And they were influenced, and then they went in and annexed Korea in 1910. They just said, you're part of Japan now. And here's what they did. So the Japanese, in an effort to reinforce its dominance over Korea, waged war on its culture. They forbade the speaking of Korean in schools. They required worship of the emperor. Teaching Korean history was outlawed. And only Japanese-approved textbooks were allowed. The Japanese transplanted over 100,000 families to Korea, and they were given land to cultivate. Taken from Koreans and given to the Japanese. The Japanese came in and chopped down millions of trees in Korea, replanted non-native species that were native to mainly Japan, and 750,000 men were forced to work for the Japanese, and millions of Korean women were forced to be comfort women and serve in military brothels. And more on that in a little bit. The Shinto religion was also forced on the Korean people, as well as the voluntary, again in quotes, taking of Japanese surnames. Resistance to Japan's brutal imperialism began with the organized March 1st movement in 1919, in which over 1,500 demonstrations broke out, but were viciously suppressed by the Japanese. But the desire for independence had taken hold in the hearts of the Korean people, and they worked to undermine the Japanese wherever and whenever they could. This was a systematic wiping out of Korean culture, and it's taken Korea a long time to get that culture back, because when you wipe out a generation, it's not easy to bring that back in. Some Japanese soldiers in Korea. This is just a photograph of 3 Koreans that were shot protesting that land confiscation I was talking about. Korean comfort women, there's a shot with some Japanese soldiers. They're still honoring comfort women to this day who suffered at the hands of the Japanese during their occupation through 1945. So Korea annexed in 1910, Japanese influence from the late 1800s, prior to that, all the way through 1945, almost 50 years of women being pressed into sex slavery for Japanese soldiers that were there. Brutal and inhumane are just don't even describe what went on. Just the taking down of the country in terms of how they treated people. You don't hear much about Korea in World War II. It was, you hear about it afterwards as the split happens between North and South. But in World War II, you don't get a lot of what went on in Korea. Many of you have probably heard about the comfort women and things like that, but probably didn't know a lot about the other atrocities that were going on that we just talked a little bit about there. But very awful. Yeah, okay. The March 1st movement. So 1919, March 1st, 1919, Korean resistance fighters organized these 1,500 rebellions throughout the country, and they were brutally suppressed by the Japanese. Many, many people killed, tortured, property burned, and it just awful, awful stuff. We're only a couple of days away from the 100th year anniversary of the March 1st movements, and they are planning celebrations for that. This is honored every year in Korea, and we'll get to that towards the end a little bit more on that. But there's a picture of the Korean Liberation Army trying desperately to fight against a superior Japanese force going into this. There's a picture of Protestant missionaries in Korea. Korea was ripe for the gospel, ripe for the Bible. Not only because it's the truth, but it also served as a rebellion against the Japanese forcing of Shinto and the Shinto religion on them. And so you got people coming to Christianity in a way that is, for the truth of the gospel, but also as a way of rebellion against the Japanese during this occupation time. And it flourished. Christianity flourished. We'll look at that a little bit more later. So, awful. I'm sorry, I can't even do this justice, but we got to move on. So, all right. Back on the outline, we are looking at the Japan and China. So while relations and tensions between Japan and China go back centuries, the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 was the beginning of modern-day tensions. This war started primarily because of a tug-of-war over Korea, which we talked about. With Japan winning this war, they asserted their dominance over Korea, and China lost eastern portions of Manchuria as well. So China lost the control of Korea as well as some portions of just coastal portions of Manchuria. Kind of see that a little bit here in this map. China's also got some of these islands down here in the corner, and we'll see them expand even more and more as we go. But just to give you a little flavor, see there, I did it again, flavor of what that looked like. In the 1920s, 1927 to be more precise, China was embroiled in a civil war between these two guys, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, or KMT, and they were the Chinese Nationalist Party. They were fighting Mao Zedong's Communist Party of China, the CPC. There's a couple of shots of them. They were fighting for control of the country at this point in time. That's a shot of Mao in 1927, which is right around the time we were talking about that. It's a little later shot of Chiang Kai-shek. But this is an older slide, or a slide later, but it gives you a flavor, gives you an idea of what they stood for, the areas they controlled. So Mao's Communist Party was up in the northern area of China, with Chiang Kai-shek in the southern portions. Ultimately, the Soviet Union supported Mao, United States supporting Chiang Kai-shek, communism versus capitalism. Mao got strong support from the peasants, Chiang Kai-shek from the wealthy landowners. Mao was experienced and motivated with, and they guerrilla warfare, very good at that. And Chiang Kai-shek, they call his military organization ineffective, corrupt, and poor morale. Very corrupt, not very popular, and also very brutal. They did anyway, not a great showing for them. What else do I have here? All right, we'll get back to that. At the same time, Japan's imperial army was expanding rapidly. They were outstripping their natural resources. Japan's need for raw materials to feed its growing war machine led to the staged Mukden Incident on September 19th, 1931, which gave the Japanese a pretext to invade and take over the rest of Manchuria, and they set up a puppet state called Manchukuo. So, throughout the early 1900s, Japan is growing. I mean, they're building up their military machine. It was a requirement to serve in the military as a Japanese male. They were building tanks, they were building planes, they were building ships, and they just didn't have the natural resources. So, what do? We go get them somewhere else. Imperialistic Japan, wanting to be like the rest of the Western powers, gives themselves an excuse to go do that, and this one was in Mukden, and you can see that it's right here, down here. Everybody see that one right there? And so what they did is they decided to put some explosives near a railway track, I should say, not too near the track because they didn't want to destroy the track, blew it up, blamed China, made a raid, and took over the rest of Manchuria, and basically set up right along where the Great China Wall is, essentially along that northern section or portion of China along the wall there. There's some Japanese soldiers marching into Mukden. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so I apologize. Again, another shot of them in Mukden. This is where they, here's Manchukuo up top here. This kind of gives you all the way through 1940, but this happened in 1931, so that'll give you, for the start, that'll give you there. You see how far down that goes. Manchukuo. So this is what happened. This is the area they took up there in that time frame. The last emperor was put down at that point, the last Chinese emperor. He was born in 1906. And he became emperor in 1908 at 3 years old. He was forced to abdicate in 1912. This is a little later, but I'll give you an idea of where it goes. But he was made in the Manchukuo puppet. So they brought him in there and decided, hey, we'll do that. Between 1912 and 1932, he was allowed to live in the Forbidden City in Beijing for the most part. And then just after Manchukuo, he was taken prisoner in Russia for that 5 years. He was put on trial for war crimes in 1950, spent 9 or 10 years in prison, was pardoned in 1959, worked as a worker in Beijing and died there in 1967. If anybody has seen the movie The Last Emperor, that's what that's about. So we'll get there. Okay, back on the outline. So with that raid, the false pretenses of taking over Manchuria, the Chinese filed a complaint with the then League of Nations. It took them a year to research and respond with a condemnation of the Japanese. The Japanese promptly ignored it, and the League's demands to return Manchuria back to China, and then they quit the League of Nations, Japan did. So the League of Nations had no teeth, it had no military might, no military power, and it was ineffective in its operations. It takes a year to come back with a finding on that. That's probably disappointing to the Chinese people, having taken their land from them. Soon after that, the Japanese attacked Shanghai in January of 1932. The Battle of Shanghai ended on May 5th. It was a lopsided Shanghai ceasefire. This was the first Battle of Shanghai, I guess you could call it. And they made other nations helped make the ceasefire happen, but yet the lopsided terms were Shanghai became a demilitarized zone, but they forbade China to garrison troops in the area surrounding Shanghai, Suzhou and Kunshan, but allowed the presence of a few Japanese units in the city. China was allowed to keep only a small police force within the city. So China didn't even get to really take care of its own city under this particular ceasefire that the Japanese, perpetrated and attacked on them. And that later will become, in the Second Battle of Shanghai, there was a limited amount of troops and equipment that you could have in Shanghai in these zones. There was a foreign zone in Shanghai. A lot of the Christian missionaries, when they came to Shanghai, to China, would launch out of that foreign zone and into the interior of China to do their missionary work. But Japan, against the treaty and what they were allowed to do, brought in more and more troops, more and more equipment. And so when the next Battle of Shanghai comes, it's a rout and a bloodbath there. I wanted to briefly jump into this in Manchukuo. So one of the things the Japanese did is set up this area called Unit 731. I watched a documentary on this. Brutal. This is where the Japanese did all kinds of experiments on Chinese citizens, including diseases, biological warfare, chemical warfare, all kinds of medical experiments to try and see how the human body reacted to different things. Reading about it was very disturbing. So they carried out biological, chemical warfare on human subjects. Things like plague, cholera, anthrax, multiple venereal diseases were people were infected with to see how the body reacted. Later on, this research was used to kill, this is an estimate, up to 400,000 Chinese people, especially as Japan is having to retreat in the late 1942 time. They were seeding chemicals in the water supply, in the fields, in the food supplies, anything they could do to cause as much damage as they could as they were having to retreat a little bit. Vivisection, they were cutting up bodies a lot of the time, most of the time without any anesthesia and things of that nature. Subjected people to frostbite to see how the body would react to that. I mean, just some very heinous, just awful things that were happening there. And the unfortunate thing, most unfortunate especially, is America gave everybody in that unit, for the most part, a pass in exchange for the research that was done. Little known facts of our country at that time, so not pretty. Okay, let's go back to the outline. So we've got rising and falling tensions between the two nations between 1932 and 1937. A lot of skirmishes back and forth, but they usually died down during that 6-year period or so. You'd have a little escalation and down. Until July 7th, 1937, which we mark as the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which then carried right into World War II until 1945 when it ended. The KMT with Chiang and the CPC with Mao, they set aside their civil war during this time from 1937 and to unite to fight the Japanese. Again, Mao in the north and Chiang in the south. After the war resumed, they resumed their civil war, and Mao ended up, obviously, as we know, winning that, and the communists eventually taking control in 1949. Chiang Kai-shek, he fled to Taiwan and ruled there until 1975. In case you didn't know that. And that's when he died, in 1975 in Taiwan. So the Marco Polo Bridge incident, that's Marco Polo Bridge right there. This is a modern-day map, obviously, but I wanted you to see how close that was to Beijing. Again, the Japanese used the excuse of the Marco Polo Bridge incident to launch a full-scale attack into Shanghai and Nanking, which at that point was the capital, Nanjing today. They were attacked at the beginning of August of 1937. Shanghai fell 2 months later, and there were 300,000 people killed during that invasion. So that's the Marco Polo Bridge today. A little memorial to it. Those are some of the mortar fire on the side of the bridge, shell firings from that attack. So Shanghai, first place to get attacked. Just a couple of photos of the destruction. Lots of air raids were flown, indiscriminate of military or civilian buildings or objectives. And you'd have to be with 300,000 people being killed during that battle. There's a victorious Japanese army in Shanghai. A little bit of the destruction and some of the homelessness and destitute families there sitting on the side of that platform. Here's a missionary account of what went on during those 1937 attacks. And the Japanese army, as they moved further away from Shanghai to get to Nanking. And they were stationed at, Jiangyin. It's just about 100 miles east of Shanghai. It's on the Yangtze River as well. They say at first every Chinese who was seen, this is by the Japanese, was shot in both the city and the country. He said that it was safer now, that if one could keep a stiff upper lip and not show fear, that he could go many places and remain safe. That's him. He could do that as a foreign missionary. That as long as the Japanese or Chinese bandits did not get to him. He said that at the outset of the Japanese occupation, the Japanese soldiers would drive down the highway, and when they saw workmen in the fields, they would simply stop the car and get out, take aim, and shoot the poor farmers in cold blood for no other reason than their own pleasure at slaughtering people. Missionaries didn't necessarily escape the violence, but they did get off much better than most of the Chinese people than the Japanese encountered. There's a picture, that's the missionary that wrote that segment. There's a lot of entries in this, which was very interesting to read, but that's a picture of him with Chinese missionaries as well. Nanking. So we got Shanghai falling, and then Nanking fell in December. And then you have the Nanking Massacre, or the rape of Nanking, going on for 2 months after that. More than 200,000 people were killed during this period. Women of all ages were raped, and many men and women were tortured before they died. This got a lot of press in the world, what happened in Nanjing. Searching images for this was disturbing, and I will spare you many of them, but you will see just a little bit of some of the death that went on. They would, for sport, they had contests of beheading people, or the Chinese people. The goal for the Japanese was to break the spirit, break the will of the Chinese people. And that's what they attempted to do. You can read a little bit more about that on your own. It is awful. I mean, it's awful. The images were awful. So, fearing the attack on Nanking, Chiang had moved the capital to Chongqing. We'd called it Chongqing at the time, but forgive my pronunciation. Chongqing at this time, currently. So streams of refugees and soldiers poured into Chongqing via Wuhan from Shanghai and Nanking. So they knew a lot of this was coming, but as soon as Shanghai got attacked, refugees from Shanghai going to Nanking, moving further east along the Yangtze, trying to get away from what's going on there. On May 3rd, 1939, the Japanese began bombing the new capital of Chongqing and would not let up for 4 years. Chongqing suffered a total of 268 air raids in that time, dropping over 11,000 incendiary bombs. 10,000 people, just over 10,000 people lost their lives from the city. Most of the city was destroyed. The death toll would have been a lot worse, but the Chinese were much better prepared for the air raids. They dug a lot more shelters to protect the people and to protect a lot of their industry. The Chinese never surrendered, and they essentially tied up tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and equipment in China that could not be used on other fronts, which was very, very important, very key. But a couple of the stories I read and some of the stuff you'll get from a lot of the U.S. War Department propaganda at the time. I was reading about how the Chinese dismantled their factories as they were preparing for these attacks, moving them east so that they could continue to fight. And so they put them in caves and in tunnels that they had built to continue manufacturing further east, where the Japanese, they figured they would stretch the lines of communication, stretch the supply lines, so that nobody could reach, so that they couldn't be reached. And it worked. It worked. They weren't able to move that far in. They were able to fly their air raids, and they had plenty of bombers and fighter planes to do that with. The Japanese did. But obviously, you can see where Chongqing is right here, and way, way away from the ocean, and the Japanese fleet, which was also huge, couldn't their guns aren't going to reach there at all. But they burned fields behind them to leave nothing for the Japanese. That was the idea. We don't want to leave them anything that they can use, that they can dig in and keep on us. So they were able to hunker down there and begin to formulate a response, an attack back against the Japanese from that. Some of the things that happened during that, here's a story about Chiang Kai-shek. He, in order to try and stop the advancing Japanese army, broke all the levees, or a lot of the levees along the river, and flooded out a lot of the areas. Unfortunately, he killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese at the same time doing that, but also did manage to kill a lot of the Japanese army during that time as well. So just give you an idea of who Chiang Kai-shek was in that little story. Chongqing, there's just some photos of the bombings that were going on in that city. This is now the capital city. It had been moved from Nanking at that time. The first 2 days were the worst, May 3rd and 4th, and shot of that. Again, there's were at. So here's Japan now at this point. They've got, essentially they hold Manchuria. They've got control of these areas, and you can see the little pink islands and things around there, which, by the way, match your worksheet today, which, like it wasn't intended, but you can see where they're, thank you, gives you a flavor of where they were at. But yeah, I mean, look at what they control. You can see the years they took over, okay? But they've got all this area right now, and just the coastline here of China and some of the major cities. So let's move to Japan and the Pacific Theater. So as the Japanese continued to occupy China, their victories in the Pacific Theater came swiftly. So following the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan attacked Hong Kong and the Philippines on December 8th, the very next day. We talked a little bit about that, if you remember, when we looked at 5 famous leaders. We looked at Macarthur and General Macarthur and his response when he was in the Philippines. You can see that on the class archives. I don't know about the guy that did it, but at least you'll get some idea what went on. Hong Kong surrendered on December 25th, and General Macarthur in the Philippines, they actually lasted until May of 1942. Macarthur was pulled out first. The month earlier than that, in May, they surrendered. 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers were taken captive and forced on the infamous Bataan Death March. We talked about that also in that Macarthur series or message, where approximately 10,000 men died or were murdered. The Japanese held the Philippines until late 1944, until the U.S. actually returned and freed them. But during that time, they estimate about 1 million Filipinos died at the hands of the Japanese. So there's Pearl Harbor. It's the Arizona going down. And then Los Angeles Times article on the front page article on the Philippines being invaded. And there's a shot of the Bataan Death March. So after that, a couple months after that, we had something called the Doolittle Raid. You remember that? It's there's the movie Pearl Harbor. You saw that. They showed the Doolittle Raid. And what they did is, if you remember, they stripped down a lot of their bombers and did something unthinkable, had them take off from the aircraft carriers that they had out in the ocean to make a strike on Tokyo. The U.S. wanted to show some level of resistance and try and strike at the heart of Tokyo, break the will a little bit, make them nervous. It was a one-way flight. They dropped their bombs, and then they ditched their planes. A lot of them ditched their planes in China, because there was no way to get back, so they crash landed there, or up in Russia there, you can see those. It was, it was a success. It did what it was meant to do, and there's some shots of one of the planes crash landing in China. There's some of the American pilots with Chinese citizens who helped them. The Chinese cared for them. They took them. They were happy that the U.S. struck back at Japan. However, here's some of the aftermath of the Doolittle Raid, and this is from one of the missionaries. The Japanese response to the Doolittle Raid against the Chinese people was equally as awful as what they did in Shanghai and in Nanking. More probably related to Nanking. By early June, the devastation had begun. Father Wendelin Dunker observed the result of a Japanese attack on the town of Yihuang. They shot any man, woman, child, cow, hog, or just about anything that moved. They raped any woman from the age of 10 to 65, and before burning the town, they thoroughly looted it. He continued writing in his unpublished memoir, None of the humans shot were buried either, but were left to lay on the ground to rot, along with the hogs and the cows. This happened in numerous cities in China as a result of the Doolittle Raid. I read some other information on that, and it was the U.S. sounds like they figured or they knew that the Japanese reprisals would be pretty bad against those that gave help to the U.S. soldiers, and it was. Here's another missionary account. The Japanese marched into the walled city of Nanchang. That's not Nanking or Nanjing, it's a different city. At dawn on the morning of June 11th, beginning of reign of terror so horrendous that the missionaries would later dub it the Rape of Nanchang. Soldiers rounded up 800 women and herded them into a storehouse outside the East Gate. For 1 month, the Japanese remained in Nanchang, roaming the rubble-filled streets in loincloths, much of the time drunk, a good part of the time, and always on the lookout for women. That was from the Reverend Frederick McGuire. So let's move down. So the Malay Peninsula was attacked on December 10th. That's all of Thailand, what we know as Thailand, Siam at the time, Malaysia, all the way down towards Singapore. The Thai government allied itself with Japan on December 21st. Had no choice, really. In January of 1942, Burma and the Dutch East Indies, that would be Indonesia, mainly, Manila and Kuala Lumpur all were captured. The Allied forces in Singapore were completely surrounded, and they were forced to surrender on February 15th, 1942. 130,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war, making it the largest surrender in British military history. The Japanese fleet drove the British from the Indian Ocean, basically confining them to the Indian coast. And by mid-1942, the Japanese Empire was at its height. Their superior weapons and tactics were unequaled at this point by the Allies, and Japan, quite frankly, looked invincible. This is the height of their imperialism. Missionaries in all of these areas, both not just the Philippines and China, even Japan, they said the common occurrence of captured U.S. missionaries in the Philippines, in Japan and China, they lacked adequate food and water, filthy living conditions, illnesses and disease, and an inability to communicate with the outside world. Occasionally, some missionaries were subjected to incessant questioning. They were marched from camp to camp, beatings. Typically, they endured the hardships, as this is from a missionary's journal, but their faith were strengthened, and they performed further service even after the war during that time. These were dark days. These were awful times. The things that went on by the Japanese soldiers perpetrated on the Chinese people, the Korean people, and other captured nations, which we didn't even get into, is unspeakable. So let's take a look at the aftermath of Japanese imperialism. The brutal treatment of conquered nations during Japan's imperialism left its mark on Southeast Asia, but especially in Korea and in China. It left a lasting political, economic, diplomatic, and social effect. As you can see, especially in Korea, where you're wiping out culture, family units, it takes decades and decades to recover from something like that. This is just one estimate of military deaths. These are just soldiers that died from each country. You can see China, 2.2 million. Japan, 1.2 million. United States, 405,000. Soviet Union was 7.5 million. That's just military deaths. And you'll see a lot of different estimates by different sources. Quite frankly, nobody really knows an exact number. That's why you always see ranges and everybody having different estimates. In Korea, some historians speculate that the Japanese occupation in 1910 was one of the things that led to the split of North and South Korea. The factions that were created to oppose the Japanese later aligned themselves with either the communists or the democratic nations, which ultimately led to the division of Korea, of the Korean Peninsula after World War II. And those are still felt to today, right? We're still feeling that split today. The remembrance of the March 1st movement is celebrated each year in remembrance of Korean resistance to the Japanese. The Korean women who were forced to serve as comfort women are honored regularly for their courage through that suffering. This is a shot of a previous March 1st day parade. And as I told you, this will mark the 100th year in just a couple of days of the March 1st resistance. That is the president of Korea, along with a picture of some of the Korean liberation armies and resistance fighters back there. They took this picture in honor or in readiness to get for this celebration that's coming up in just a couple of days here in Korea. So this is a statue, a comfort woman statue. This one's actually in Taiwan. It is set up there across the street from the Japanese embassy, I believe, which the Japanese didn't like. And this was just recent. This was in 2018. So if you don't think that's not prevalent or still relevant, it is. I told you about Christianity taking hold in Korea. So there's 51 million people in Korea. That's as of 2015. I got that stat. 21.5 million of them say they are in some religion. And 9.68 of them, 9.7 million people, are claiming a Protestant or Christian faith. And many of you have heard of the Christian movement in Korea. It's huge, and it's great to see. It took hold and it stayed, and that is awesome. Those aren't all the aftermaths. There's a lot more things that reverberate through this. I'm just giving you, again, some very broad looks at this, same as with China. Can't hope to even codify in 1 hour the impact. But the atrocities in China committed in places like Nanking, Shanghai, Chongqing, have never been forgotten by the Chinese people. Their effects affects their relation to this day. Japan's whitewashing and downplaying of their wartime brutality, and coupled with the veneration of the Japanese war heroes, is especially offensive to the Chinese people to this day. China's resistance of the Japanese army provided a newfound identity. It ultimately expressed itself in Mao's Communist Party after defeating Chiang's KMT in 1949. Not the effect, but I'm certain that from what I've been reading, that the resistance the Chinese were able to provide out of Chongqing and then to push the Japanese back, the tying up, the bringing together as a nation, with very little help from any of the allies up until this point, created a national spirit. It just so happens the Chinese Communist Party did win that group and is obviously still in power today. But providing that identity there for that. So here's another just of the Chinese army casualties. You can just look at the total at the bottom, 3.3 million total wounded or killed, 1.3 million killed. See the bottom one? It's just cut off of your screen there, but that's civilian casualties, not included. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 million that's the high estimate. Even the low estimate of somewhere in the low 20 million range is still, unthinkable. There's Mao. Christianity in China. So you can see this graph stops at 2013 down here, 86 million. There is a count right now of 243 million by the year 2030, they believe will be Chinese Christians. There'll be more Christians in China by then than the U.S. That's, from the legacy of guys like Hudson Taylor and the other missionaries that we've studied that went to China. So that has taken hold there as well. What happens when a nation forgets God? Doesn't know God, unthinkable things happen, unspeakable things happen. You can just look to biblical history for that, right? Think about Judges, right? A whole generation was not taught about the God that had brought them out of Egypt with amazing miracles, and they did unspeakable things. They sacrificed to idols. They sacrificed their children to the gods of the Canaanites. Unspeakable things is what happens when a nation doesn't know God or forgets God. We even see that in our own nation as we forget God. Now, we haven't killed, adults, but we're certainly killing children, unborn children, millions of them. But understanding who God is and what He has done, it provides us with the context of how we should treat others and how we should treat humanity in general, regardless of how they look, how they think, how they act. And we see that just in this small sampling of what we took. I mean, a nation of Japan doesn't know. I mean, you saw the stats just today. 2% are Christians. The rest, mostly Shinto and Buddhist. They don't know the true God. And when a nation doesn't know God or forgets God, they do unspeakable things. Think about that in terms of your own evangelism. Think about the people around you that need to know God. Not that they're going to be doing unspeakable things, but it should prompt us to want to be more diligent and more persistent in our evangelism to those in our spheres of influence. Because when a nation forgets God and doesn't know God, unspeakable things, they happen. Would you pray with me? Father God, we are thankful that we know you, that we have a relationship with you. We are thankful that you have provided the means of having that relationship through your Son, Jesus. God, we confess that we don't do enough to share that message with others. So God, we just ask right now for your help. Give us the courage, give us the opportunity to speak about your Son to others, because we know that through Christ, it's the only means to you and to salvation. And we can see, as just our little look here at one section of history, what can happen when people don't know who you and what they're allowed to do, when they don't see the image of you, your creation in others, how bad it can get. God, help us. We don't want to ever see that happen again. So help us to be diligent. Help us to be persistent in our own personal evangelism. And pray these things in Jesus' name.